Welcome to the Sin of Malice Exposed podcast, an extended 6-part teaching presented as one continuous listening experience. In this episode set, I unpack a theological hypothesis that connects Ezekiel's wheels within wheels to what I call the infinity orbit structure inside the PTS-RUS framework, a symbolic geometry of grace, distortion, delay, covenant alignment, and restoration, centered on Christ as the fixed axis. For the visual diagrams that go with what you're hearing, you can follow along on my website, www.thesinofmaliceexposed.weebly.com. And a quick note, I'm still learning the editing side of all this, so thank you for bearing with me as I get better with the technology. You'll hear 6 episodes in sequence. Episode 1, Wheels Within Wheels, Why I Believe Ezekiel Saw the Infinity Orbit Structure. Episode 2, Mapping the Vision to the 3-track Orbit, Axis, Covenant Wheel, Delay Wheel, and Flux Pressure. Episode 3, Flux Saturation, Cain's Veil. Thinning, the collapse of the middle wheel, and why astrology can only read the shadows. Episode 4, The Mercy Seat. Activates, reconnection, collapse, and the separation of wheat and tares. Episode 5, The Gospel in Geometric Terms, the axis entering distortion, the veil tearing, and the cube revealed. Episode 6, The Cosmic Circuit, component mapping and real-world discernment through covenant geometry. Between each episode, there will be a brief 30-second pause to give you space to breathe, reflect, and reset. And you may notice the transitions don't always include a full introduction. Chalk that up to a few technology malfunctions on my end. The content is intentionally dense, so feel free to pause at any time, take breaks, and return when you're ready. All right, let's begin. Welcome back. In this series, I'm not trying to give you a new set of religious words. I'm trying to give you a map, a circuit diagram, a way to see why grace moves the way it moves, why delay feels the way it feels, and why Scripture keeps describing history like a machine that is spinning, turning, and tightening, yet still moving straight forward. So today we start with the center, not the loops, not the nodes, not the drama, the center. Because if you don't have the center, everything else becomes either superstition or speculation or fear. And Scripture does not start with fear. It starts with order. The first component of the cosmic circuit is this: Christ is the vertical axis. He is not a phase. He is not a reaction. He is not the result of history. He is the fixed line that history rotates around. That's why Ezekiel can describe motion that turns, yet never drifts. Wheels within wheels, spinning, layered, multidirectional, but still moving straight forward. That's not ordinary movement. That's axis-governed movement. Rotation without deviation. Motion without rebellion. That kind of motion only exists when something unmovable holds orientation. So in my framework, I call that unmovable line the Christ axis. It's the covenant spine. It pierces the whole structure. It holds the geometry together even while the system is under torsion. And this is where Colossians becomes more than comfort language. In him all things hold together, not poetically, structurally. Here's the simplest way I can say it. If all you have is orbit, you only have cycles. If all you have is loops, you only have delay. If all you have is feedback, you only have fate. But an axis introduces something that fate cannot tolerate: a straight line through the coil. That is what grace is. Grace is not merely kindness. Grace is orientation. Grace is the ability of the eternal to remain eternal while entering distortion, without becoming distorted. That is Christ. He doesn't get absorbed by the loops. He pierces them. Now, let me connect this to our deeper claim. The sin of malice is not just disobedience. It is the bending of grace into resistance. And the moment grace meets resistance, the system starts behaving like a coil. Grace begins to circulate under pressure. Delay begins to form. A veil appears. A chamber stabilizes the pinch. And what we experience as mortal time becomes a kind of torsion-based illusion, an extended loop masquerading as linear inevitability. But here's the key. Even when the system coils, the axis does not coil. Even when the veil flickers, the axis does not flicker. Even when the chamber fills with flux, the axis remains clean. That's why the gospel is not God adapting to evil. It is God introducing an unbreakable line through evil. When people read wheels within wheels, they tend to focus on the wheels, but the vision never lets you stop there, because above the machinery is the throne. Meaning, the system moves, but it is ruled. The motion is real, the complexity is real, the nested structure is real, but the authority is higher than the cycles. And in my model, that authority is shown as the axis. Christ is the stabilizer. Christ is the collapse mechanism. Christ is the one line that can end the loop without destroying the creation inside it. And I want you to hear this clearly. The axis is not passive. It isn't simply a pole holding the structure together while we wait for the end. It is the mechanism by which the end happens. Because when flux reaches saturation, when the system cannot stretch delay any further, only one thing can resolve it: collapse into the axis. That's why the cross is not only forgiveness, it is torsion bearing. It is the axis entering the coil at maximum pressure. That's why the descent into Sheol is not a side quest. It is the axis piercing the pinch from within. And that's why resurrection is not just life again. It is the axis reappearing unbroken after carrying the full weight of the coil. So, what does this mean for real life? It means your faith is not meant to be lived inside cycles of fear. It means you are not meant to interpret your life as a closed wheel. It means the throne is above the mechanism. And it means grace is not a horoscope. Grace is not a pattern you decode. Grace is a person, an axis, who can cut through what patterns can never heal. This is why prophecy is not astrology. Astrology reads the outer loops. Prophecy reads the axis. One maps distortion. The other reveals coherence. Now, if Christ is the axis, what completes the circuit? Because a straight line alone is not yet a living system. A circuit needs a ground. It needs an anchoring wire that allows the current to stabilize and flow. And this is where Adam enters, not as a mere character, but as a function. Welcome back. In episode 1, I centered everything on the axis, because if you miss the axis, you will misread the wheels. You'll start thinking Scripture is describing chaos, when it's actually describing governed motion. Rotation without drift, complexity without rebellion, a system moving straight forward because something unmovable holds orientation. Now, in episode 2, I'm going to build outward from that center and show you why the circuit doesn't start with Eve alone, and it doesn't start with Mary, and it doesn't start with Cain. It starts with grounding, because in any system where light is meant to transmit, there has to be a stabilizing return path. That's what Adam is in this model. Track 1, the grounding wire. Adam is not better because he is first. He is functional in the circuit. He anchors covenantal wisdom so the prism can transmit. Without a ground, the system either floats, flickers, or becomes vulnerable to hijack. In spiritual terms, grounding is what allows wisdom to carry divine current without becoming a runaway feedback loop. So here is the core of the mapping. Christ is the axis, the unbroken stabilizer. Adam is the grounding wire, the covenant return path. Eve is the prism, the inner magnetosphere, the threshold vessel where white light bends into creation. And you need all three to understand why the fall didn't erase grace, but coiled it. Because the moment Eve bends toward the serpent, the prism doesn't vanish. It fractures. The current doesn't stop. It pressurizes. The light doesn't die. It begins to circulate under resistance. This is why I keep saying the sin of malice is structural. It's not just a bad moment. It is the first willed torsion applied to a system that was designed to transmit cleanly. Think of it like this. Eve's prism is the place where divine light refracts into the created spectrum. That refraction is not evil. It's how creation becomes creation. But when resistance enters, when the serpent introduces leverage, refraction turns into coil. The same flow that was meant to pass through and return now begins to loop. And what stabilizes that loop long enough for history to exist is the emergence of the middle track, the delay chamber. But before I go there, I want you to feel how precise this is. Eve is not merely the one who sinned. In this framework, Eve is the threshold vessel. She is the inner magnetosphere, meaning she is the region where covenantal light circulates close to the axis, stable and protected, before it gets dragged into outer flux. So when I say Eve is the blue track, I'm saying she represents the original covenant flow, the wheat line, the wisdom line, the clean channel of divine current. And Adam grounds that flow. He completes it. He anchors it. That's why the serpent targets the vessel. Because if you can destabilize the prism, you can introduce curvature without destroying the axis. And if you can introduce curvature, you can create delay. And if you can create delay, you can build a world system on top of it. That's Babylon in our language. Not just a city, but an economy of distortion. An entire order built on extended cycles of coiled grace. Now we step outward to the next component, Mary Samaria as to track 2, the magnetotail, the delay chamber, the toroidal pinch. I'm saying this carefully as a hypothesis inside the symbolic geometry we've been building. Mary is not the origin of covenantal light. She is the containment structure that holds coiled grace under pressure. She looks like stability, she behaves like restraint, but she is derivative, not generative. She does not create the current. She holds the current after it has already been bent. So in the cosmic circuit, Mary's function is like a pressure tank. She stabilizes the coil created by malice. She holds wheat and tares in the same orbit. She delays collapse. And that delay makes history feel long. It makes cycles repeat. It makes the world feel like fate. This is why the wheel within wheel effect matters, because a middle wheel can mimic stability while actually prolonging distortion. It can sit inside the orbit and keep it spinning, appearing to restrain chaos, when in reality it is buying borrowed time for lawlessness to mature. That's why Paul's language about what restrains is so important to this model. I do not call Mary the true restrainer. I call her false restraint, a distortion chamber that mimics restraint by holding flux in orbit. The true restraint in this framework is the Eve line, the covenant thread from first Eve to last Eve, because only alignment to the axis can cap distortion's power. The chamber can only contain. It cannot heal. And this is where Cain enters as the third track indicator. Cain is the ungrounded seed, an auroral LED, a flickering signal of rebellion and tension. Cain's mark is the veil, the semi-transparent seam across the sphere's mid-latitudes that divides inner covenantal flow from outer delay. Cain's mark is not merely a curse, it is a feedback indicator. It is the visible sign that the system is under torsion, and that delay has become structural. So now you can see why I say the missing track is not missing, it's thinning. Because that seam is what flickers when flux is reaching saturation. The veil becomes semi-transparent when the delay chamber is near its limit. And when it thins, something starts happening that people feel in real time. Compression, polarization, acceleration. The shortening of days in lived experience is what it feels like when a system can't stretch the loop any further. Now, let me name the external hijackers in this circuit, because they explain why the outer loops get so chaotic. Lucifer is the outer shadow orbit, the perturbing force pressurizing the system, sustaining distortion loops, creating false prism effects. Lilith is the temporal detachment node, where track 2 and track 3 intersect, feeding the toroidal pinch with mortal flux. Jezebel is the counterfeit circuit, reversing polarity, hijacking flow, amplifying delay. These aren't just characters. They are the principles of hijack: inversion, reflection, counterfeit stability, and pressure amplification. And they matter because they explain how distortion can look like wisdom and how delay can look like holiness, and how orbit can look like destiny. But the entire system is moving toward one appointed event, collapse. And in this model, collapse is not annihilation. Collapse is the resolution of coil into axis. That's why the last Eve, the bride, sits at the apex as track 3 in its true form. Not Cain's flicker, but the orange loop of restoration. The bride is the damping input. She is the prism of restoration. She collapses flux, dissolves the middle orbit, tears the veil seam, and reconnects Eve's original prism to the axis in unfractured flow. And when that happens, the outcome is not another loop. It's a new geometry. The cube, New Jerusalem, flatness, alignment, no curvature, no delay, no mirrored seam, no chamber, no astrology, no fate economy, just coherence. Axis revealed, prism transparent, circulation uncoiled. So here's the key takeaway of episode 2, without redundancy. The circuit is not random. Each figure is a function. Christ is the axis. Adam grounds. Eve refracts. Mary contains. Cain's mark signals strain. Lucifer pressurizes. Jezebel hijacks. Lilith detaches. The bride collapses the loop and restores alignment. In the next episode, I'm going to do something very specific. I'm going to walk you through the sequence of saturation, how Cain's veil thins, how the middle wheel collapses, how the man of lawlessness is unveiled as concentrated distortion, and why astrology can only read the shadows as long as delay remains stretched. Because once you see saturation, you'll understand why the world feels like it's accelerating, and why that acceleration is not merely social panic, but structural inevitability in the geometry of redemption. Part 1. Now we're going into the next piece, the one that connects the vision to real life without flattening it into headlines. Because prophecy always touches history, but it doesn't begin with history. It begins with the structure. And in this model, the structure tells you what a collapse feels like before you can name what it is. So this episode is about flux saturation, Cain's veil thinning, the collapse of the middle wheel, the unveiling of lawlessness, and why astrology can only read shadows as long as delay remains stretched. In other words, why the world can feel like it's speeding up, why patterns can feel like they're breaking, and why the system that once looked stable starts eating itself. Let me start with the clearest indicator in the sphere, Cain's mark. Cain's mark is not just a personal stigma. It is a seam. It's the first visible stress line in creation, an auroral boundary that runs across the toroidal loops like a semi-transparent band. In our language, it's the veil. It functions like a stabilizing membrane. It holds flux in tension, separates the inner covenant flow from the outer delay orbit, and, most importantly, it signals how close the system is to saturation. That's why I call it the missing track. Not because it's absent, but because it's semi-invisible until it starts thinning. And when it thins, you're seeing something you can't unsee. The system is reaching its limit. Here's how that thinning happens. The middle track, the delay chamber, the toroidal pinch, accumulates flux. That flux is not neutral. It's coiled grace under resistance, tears maturing alongside wheat, distortion circulating alongside covenant memory, pressure building in the orbit that is stabilizing the illusion of continuity. So as that orbit fills, it begins to behave like a pressure tank under maximum load. At first, it stabilizes. It looks like restraint. It looks like history as usual. It looks like empire continuing, systems continuing, cycles continuing. But as apostasy intensifies, as distortion reaches fullness, the seam begins to flicker. That flicker is the veil losing opacity. In plain terms, the membrane that once made delay feel normal begins to reveal the fracture beneath it. This is why I say polarization peaks as the veil thins, because the veil is the divider between two flows, the inner magnetosphere of covenantal wisdom and the outer magnetotail of delay. When it thins, those two regions begin to interpenetrate. Light starts leaking across the boundary, and when inner light begins touching outer flux, you don't get peace. You get exposure. You get separation. You get collapse pressure. That is what thinning actually means. The derivative system can no longer keep the covenant flow quarantined. And the moment that quarantine fails, everything that was circulating unseen begins to show. Now bring Paul into this. Paul says the mystery of lawlessness is already at work, but restrained until the appointed time. Here's the distinction I hold in this framework. The middle wheel mimics restraint, but it is not the true restrainer. It's false restraint. It buys borrowed time. It contains distortion, so it can mature without collapsing early. That's why it can look holy. That's why it can look protective. That's why it can look like stability. But it is parasitic stability, stability that exists only because it is hosting the coiled pressure. The true restraint is the Eve line, the covenant thread from the first Eve to the last Eve, because only alignment to Christ's axis can actually cap distortion's power. So what happens at saturation is not that restraint is removed in the sense of goodness disappearing. It's that false restraint fails. The pressure tank ruptures, the middle wheel collapses. And when it collapses, the unveiling happens. Part 2. Now this is where people misunderstand the unveiling of the man of lawlessness. They imagine it as a random villain arriving on stage. In this model, the man of lawlessness is the concentrated projection of distortion when the womb of delay tears open. While the middle wheel holds, distortion circulates diffusely. It's spread out across history. It's normalized. It's institutionalized. It can hide behind cycles. But when the chamber fails, all that diffuse distortion concentrates. What was hidden becomes visible in full form, not because something new was created, but because something that was distributed is now forced into exposure. That's what unveiling is: concentration, revelation, compression. A shadow system forced into a single face. And that's why Babylon collapses the way Revelation describes. The system devours itself. The scaffolding fails. The kings turn. The city burns. Because a delay-based structure cannot survive when delay can no longer stretch. It eats its own stabilizers. It cannibalizes its own supports. Now, here is the most important experiential marker: time compression. Jesus says the days are shortened for the elect. You can read that spiritually, but in this geometry, you can also read it structurally. Shortening of days is what it feels like when the toroidal loop can't keep extending the sequence. The system stops stretching. It contracts toward the axis. Cycles tighten. Events stack. Outcomes accelerate. People describe it as everything is happening at once. That is literally the signature of contraction. It's not just anxiety. It's the pinch point losing its ability to buffer. The veil thins. The chamber destabilizes. The loop tightens. The axis begins asserting itself through the system. Which brings me to astrology, because this is where the real-world contrast becomes sharp. Astrology in this framework is not nothing. It is a shadow map. It tracks the outer toroidal loops of delay, cycles, pressures, timing patterns. That's why people can feel like it works in a delay phase. When distortion is stretched out, the loop produces repeatable rhythms. Planetary cycles become a language for flux pressure nodes. Saturn reads like time and constriction. Venus reads like desire bound to mortality. The moon reads like tides and emotional metronomes. Mars reads like pressure release. Eclipse windows feel like amplified crossroads. Astrology can map those rhythms because it is reading the shell. But here's the ceiling. Astrology cannot pierce the axis. It reads the wheel, not the axle. It reads the weather pattern, not the source of the storm. It reads distortion as causality. It confuses the loop for ultimate order. So what happens at flux saturation is astrology's authority collapses. The patterns lose coherence because the system is no longer stretched. The tide is rushing in. Horoscopes written in sand. Predictions fail because the loop itself is contracting toward the axis. And this is where covenant geometry becomes loud. Covenant geometry doesn't predict distortion, it reveals alignment. It shows you the axis, the prism, the seam, the pinch, and the collapse path. So at saturation, geometry asserts itself violently, not as violence for its own sake, but as the force of alignment overtaking a delay-based world. The loops contract. The bride is drawn into the axis. The mercy seat activates, and I need you to hear how I mean that. The mercy seat is not a decorative symbol in this model. It is the reconnection node, the apex point where every current converges along the Christ axis. In cosmic language, it's like magnetic reconnection, the place where the system snaps, where pressure that was stored in the loops can no longer remain stored, where the whole structure stops pretending it can stretch forever and finally discharges into alignment. That's what the mercy seat is doing. It is the operational hinge where coiled grace is released back into unfractured flow, where distortion doesn't get negotiated with, it gets collapsed. Not by force, but by truth, by contact with the axis. So, what happens when the mercy seat activates? First, the veil tears, not as metaphor, but as mechanics. Cain's seam dissolves because the boundary layer that held tension in place is no longer needed once the system is being pulled into the axis. The middle orbit collapses because delay cannot survive proximity to the collapse point. Mary's chamber, the pinch that stabilized coiled grace under pressure, is overridden. It cannot continue acting as a container once the structure has reached saturation. In a delay phase, containment looks like stability. At the mercy seat, containment is exposed as postponement. The system stops being buffered. The loops tighten. The borrowed time expires. And this is where separation becomes unavoidable, because the same pressure that collapses the loop also reveals what each structure is made of. You don't have to announce wheat and tears. The physics of the collapse reveals them. Under axis pressure, a prism bends and refracts, meaning it yields, it transmits, it returns light to the source. A mirror refuses. It reflects and preserves itself. It insists on holding the loop. So, in the moment of reconnection, you see clearly what was covenant, and what was containment, what was wisdom, and what was imitation, what was surrender, and what was preservation. That's why I say the threshing isn't just a doctrine, it's an inevitable outcome of how the system resolves. And through it all, the axis remains fixed. That's the point. The axis does not panic. The axis does not drift. The axis doesn't win by scrambling for control. It consumes the anti-axis by appearing, by being revealed as the true stabilizer that was always there. When Christ is unveiled, distortion doesn't just get judged. It loses its scaffolding. It loses its hiding place. It loses the conditions that allowed it to circulate as if it were normal. So, here's the closing synthesis of this episode, clean and direct. Cain's mark is the visible stress seam that tells you when the system is nearing its limit. The veil thinning is the sign of saturation. The middle wheel is false restraint, a delay chamber that buys borrowed time for lawlessness to mature. When it collapses, distortion concentrates and is unveiled as the man of lawlessness. Babylon's scaffolding fails, and time compresses because the loop can't stretch anymore. Astrology can read patterns in the stretched loop, but it cannot pierce the axis, so at saturation its predictive power breaks. Covenant geometry doesn't read shadows, it reads alignment. So at saturation, it becomes manifest as the system snaps toward the mercy seat, the apex where the bride intersects the axis, the reconnection node where coiled grace is released, delay dissolves, and the chariot moves unhindered under the throne. And here's my prelude into the next episode. Once you understand the mercy seat as the reconnection point, you can't unsee what it implies about the gospel itself. Because the gospel is not just forgiveness of sins in a moral sense, it is the axis entering distortion as a collapse mechanism. It is coherence stepping into resistance to uncoil what was coiled. Which means the cross isn't only a payment, it's the torsion-bearing event. The resurrection isn't only hope, it's axis reemergence, unbroken, undefeated, fully revealed. So, next, I want to translate the gospel into the geometry we've been using. Father as the coherence baseline, Son as the collapse axis, Spirit as restored circulation, and the bride as the prism finally aligned. Until the torus is gone, the seam is gone, and what remains is the cube. New Jerusalem as unbroken order, Eden's brilliance flowing without delay. The bride is drawn into the axis, the mercy seat activates, and I need you to hear how I mean that. The mercy seat is not a decorative symbol in this model, it is the reconnection node, the apex point where every current converges along the Christ axis. In cosmic language, it's like magnetic reconnection, the place where the system snaps, where pressure that was stored in the loops can no longer remain stored, where the whole structure stops pretending it can stretch forever and finally discharges into alignment. That's what the mercy seat is doing. It is the operational hinge where coiled grace is released back into unfractured flow, where distortion doesn't get negotiated with, it gets collapsed, not by force, but by truth, by contact with the axis. So what happens when the mercy seat activates? First, the veil tears, not as metaphor, but as mechanics. Cain's seam dissolves because the boundary layer that held tension in place is no longer needed once the system is being pulled into the axis. The middle orbit collapses because delay cannot survive proximity to the collapse point. Mary's chamber, the pinch that stabilized coiled grace under pressure, is overridden. It cannot continue acting as a container once the structure has reached saturation. In a delay phase, containment looks like stability. At the mercy seat, containment is exposed as postponement. The system stops being buffered, the loops tighten, the borrowed time expires, and this is where separation becomes unavoidable. Because the same pressure that collapses the loop also reveals what each structure is made of. You don't have to announce wheat and tares. The physics of the collapse reveals them. Under axis pressure, a prism bends and refracts, meaning it yields, it transmits, it returns light to the source. A mirror refuses. It reflects and preserves itself. It insists on holding the loop. So, in the moment of reconnection, you see clearly what was covenant and what was containment, what was wisdom and what was imitation, what was surrender and what was preservation. That's why I say the threshing isn't just a doctrine, it's an inevitable outcome of how the system resolves. And through it all, the axis remains fixed. That's the point. The axis does not panic. The axis does not drift. The axis doesn't win by scrambling for control. It consumes the anti-axis by appearing, by being revealed as the true stabilizer that was always there. When Christ is unveiled, distortion doesn't just get judged. It loses its scaffolding. It loses its hiding place. It loses the conditions that allowed it to circulate as if it were normal. So here's the closing synthesis of this episode, clean and direct. Cain's mark is the visible stress seam that tells you when the system is nearing its limit. The veil thinning is the sign of saturation. The middle wheel is false restraint, a delay chamber that buys borrowed time for lawlessness to mature. When it collapses, distortion concentrates and is unveiled as the man of lawlessness. Babylon's scaffolding fails, and time compresses because the loop can't stretch anymore. Astrology can read patterns in the stretched loop, but it cannot pierce the axis, so at saturation its predictive power breaks. Covenant geometry doesn't read shadows, it reads alignment, so at saturation it becomes manifest as the system snaps toward the mercy seat, the apex where the bride intersects the axis, the reconnection node where coiled grace is released, delay dissolves, and the chariot moves unhindered under the throne. And here's my prelude into the next episode. Once you understand the mercy seat as the reconnection point, you can't unsee what it implies about the gospel itself. Because the gospel is not just forgiveness of sins in a moral sense, it is the axis entering distortion as a collapse mechanism. It is coherence, stepping into resistance to uncoil what was coiled. Which means the cross isn't only a payment, it's the torsion-bearing event. The resurrection isn't only hope, it's axis reemergence, unbroken, undefeated, fully revealed. So, next, I want to translate the gospel into the geometry we've been using: Father as the coherence baseline, Son as the collapse axis, Spirit as restored circulation, and the bride as the prism finally aligned, until the torus is gone, the seam is gone, and what remains is the cube. New Jerusalem as unbroken order, Eden's brilliance flowing without delay. Part 1, Episode 5, The Gospel in Geometric Terms, the Axis Entering Distortion, the Veil Tearing, and the Cube. Revealed, if I'm going to say the mercy seat is an operational hinge, then I have to be consistent about what the gospel is in this framework. Because the gospel is not only a moral announcement, and it's not only a courtroom verdict, it's coherence entering a distorted system as the collapse mechanism that restores flow. It's the axis stepping into the torsion of the loops and doing what loops cannot do on their own. It uncoils what resistance has coiled. That's why, in geometric terms, the sin of malice is not simply breaking a rule. It's bending grace into resistance. It's the first torsion event, Eve's bite, converting transparent, massless grace into stored pressure, into feedback, into delay. And once grace is bent into resistance, certain structural consequences appear whether you name them or not. The veil becomes necessary as a boundary layer where tension can be held without immediate annihilation. The chamber becomes necessary as a pinch point where coiled grace can be contained inside history. And the illusion becomes possible. Babylon, because when delay is stabilized, the system can pretend distortion is normal, it can build cities on borrowed time, and it can teach souls to live inside the loop as if the loop is reality. So when I say Christ saves, what I mean in this model is specific. Christ is the axis of restoration entering the coil. The Son is coherence in the form of a stabilizing line, an unbroken rod that can pass through every layer of distortion without becoming distorted. That's why Scripture keeps insisting that He is steady, the same yesterday, today, and forever, the one in whom all things hold together. In a world of turning wheels, that steadiness is not a poetic trait. It is the functional requirement for collapse. Because if the axis drifted, there would be no true reconnection point. Now, let me say the cross. The way this model demands I say it, the cross is the torsion-bearing event. It is the axis taking on the full pressure of coiled grace and the full feedback of sin, not as a spectator, but as the point where the system's stored debt finally meets the one thing it cannot bend. You can picture it like this. The loops are saturated, the seam is strained, the delay chamber is holding more than it can hold, and the axis steps into the center of that strain and bears it without deviating. This is why "he bore our sins" is not sentimental language here. It's mechanical language. He bears the torsion of the coil. He carries the weight of delayed history. He enters the inertia of resistance and takes responsibility for what resistance cannot resolve. And this is why the veil tears. In the moral reading, the veil tears because access is granted. In the geometric reading, access is granted because the boundary layer is ruptured by contact with the axis at maximum pressure. The seam that held tension in place is no longer structurally necessary once the collapse mechanism is active. The veil does not tear because God is making a dramatic gesture. It tears because the system has reached the point where truth is physically reordering the structure. And when the veil tears, you don't just get a new religious experience. You get a new topology. The conditions that allowed the chamber of delay to function are now numbered. That's why I say the resurrection is axis reemergence. The axis goes into distortion, all the way into the place the loop calls final, and then it returns unbroken. That return is not merely life after death. It is the public proof that distortion did not bend the stabilizer, that the anti-axis was not stronger than coherence, and that delay is not eternal. The resurrection is the axis showing itself again as the axis, fully revealed, not merely implied. And from that moment forward, the whole system is in countdown, because once the axis has reemerged, the loops are living on borrowed time. The Spirit, then, is the restored circulation. In this model, the Spirit is not a vague force. The Spirit is coherence in motion, grace circulating through living systems, distributing what the axis has secured. And notice the order. Without the axis, circulation becomes endless looping. Without circulation, collapse becomes stasis. So the gospel is not complete unless both are true. The Son collapses distortion, and the Spirit carries restored coherence into life. This is why I summarize the gospel in geometry like this. Father, coherence baseline, the unfractured ground state beneath all oscillations. Son, collapse axis, coherence entering time to pierce distortion and break the loop. Spirit, restored circulation, coherence transmitted through the body to make the baseline active in creation. Bride, prism aligned, the vessel that refracts glory rightly because she yields to the axis instead of preserving the mirror. And now you can hear why the mercy seat matters. The mercy seat is the apex interface where this gospel becomes operational in the structure, where the axis meets the prism at saturation, where circulation is no longer trapped in delay, where the seam dissolves, where the chamber collapses, where the illusion loses its wall. That is why the end of the story isn't a spiritual idea. It's a structural outcome, New Jerusalem as the cube. Because the torus is the geometry of coiled grace, curvature, pressure, looping delay. The cube is the geometry of release, flatness, order, perfect alignment, no curvature needed because no torsion remains. The cube is not an aesthetic choice in Revelation. It's the shape you get when the system is no longer forced to bend around resistance. And the bride is not merely standing in that city as a tourist. She is that geometry made transparent, many faces folded into alignment, no longer scattering light into spectrum, but refracting it into coherent glory, because nothing is resisting the axis anymore. So I'll end this episode the way the gospel demands. Only Christ restores, because only the axis can collapse the coil. Only Christ redeems, because only coherence can pay the debt of resistance without becoming resistance. Only Christ collapses delay, because delay survives only where the axis is hidden. And what waits beyond is not a vague heaven. It is unbroken order, the seam gone, the chamber gone, the torus dissolved, the serpent's counterfeit spine shattered, and Eden's brilliance flowing unfractured forever. Episode 6, the grand apex, from wheels to cube, from orbit to wedding, from delay to direct light. This is the final turn of the whole series, because once you've seen the system, wheels within wheels, nested orbits, axis and circulation, seam and chamber, you can't leave it hanging in theory. The vision has to land, and where it lands is the wedding. Not as romance language, but as structural completion, the prism and the axis coming into permanent alignment so the system no longer needs a loop to keep it from collapsing. This is why I keep returning to Ezekiel's paradox, turning without deviation. In the delay phase, the wheels can spin and still go straight because the spirit holds orientation and the axis is present even when hidden. But at saturation, the hidden becomes revealed, and the whole structure stops behaving like a stretched orbit and starts behaving like a resolved geometry. The turning was never the point. The throne was. So here's the apex in one sentence. The end is the unveiling of the true chariot, axis firm, circulation purified, prism aligned, moving unhindered under the throne because nothing is left to bend grace into resistance. Now, let me tie every thread together cleanly. The bite coiled grace. That coil created the torus. Feedback, delay, mortal time experienced as sequence and struggle. Cain's mark was the first visible seam, the boundary layer that held tension in place so the world didn't collapse immediately. Mary, in your vocabulary, is the chamber of delay, the pinch that stabilized coiled grace under pressure, allowing history to stretch, wheat and tares to mature, lawlessness to run its course inside the loop. Lucifer is the outer perturbing orbit, pressurizing the system and sustaining the counterfeit cadence of distortion. Lilith is the temporal detachment, the feed of the pinch, the way resistance keeps re-entering circulation. And Babylon is the whole illusion built on top of that containment. An empire of normalcy inside delay, a religion of flux that reads cycles and calls them fate. That's why astrology fits here. It maps the loop. It reads the shadows on the wheel. It can feel accurate because delay creates repeatable patterns, but it can never pierce the axis, so it can never deliver anyone out of the loop. That brings us to the moment of collapse. Flux saturation is not merely things getting worse. It's the system reaching its appointed limit, the seam thinning, the veil flickering, polarization peaking because covenant light and containment light cannot keep coexisting at the same tension. Then the mercy seat activates, meaning the reconnection node becomes operational. The system snaps, not into chaos, but into alignment. The veil tears because the boundary layer is no longer needed once the axis is openly pulling the structure into truth. The middle orbit collapses because delay cannot survive proximity to the collapse point. The false restraint is exposed because what looked like stability is revealed as postponement. And at that exact point, separation is unavoidable, not because someone announces it, but because the mechanics of reconnection reveal what every structure is made of. A prism yields, refracts, transmits, and returns light to the source. A mirror resists, reflects, and preserves itself, insisting on the loop. Under axis pressure, the difference becomes visible. Wheat and tares are not a slogan here. They are the natural outcome of what happens when coiled grace is released, and each vessel either bends or refuses. And this is where the gospel becomes the climax, not the afterthought. The cross is the torsion-bearing event, the axis stepping into the maximum pressure of the coil and bearing it without drifting. The resurrection is axis reemergence, the proof that distortion did not bend coherence, that delay is not eternal, that the stabilizer is real. The spirit is restored circulation, coherence in motion, now distributing life without being trapped in a counterfeit loop. And the bride, this is the key, is the prism finally aligned. Not the chamber, not the seam, not the mirror system. The prism. The bride is the vessel that becomes transparent because she is no longer resisting the axis. Now watch how Revelation seals the geometry. New Jerusalem is described as a cube. That's not decorative. That's the final form of a system that no longer needs curvature to survive pressure. The torus is the geometry of coiled grace, curved, looped, sustained by delay. The cube is the geometry of resolved order. Flat faces, true angles, stable alignment. No looping required because no torsion remains. The cube is what you get when grace is no longer being bent into resistance. And that's why it says, "The Lamb is the lamp, and the city has no need of sun or moon," not because creation is erased, but because the loop-based timekeeping of delay is finished. No seam, no chamber, no borrowed time cycles. Direct light, unfractured flow. So here's the grand finale, the way I want you to hear it. Ezekiel's wheels were a preview of a governed system, nested motion aligned to spirit around a throne. Our orbit language was a way to describe the same paradox, turning without deviation because the axis holds orientation. But the end of the matter is not wheels forever. The end of the matter is alignment. The bride drawn into the axis, the mercy seat as reconnection hinge, the torus collapsing because grace is no longer coiled, the veil dissolving because tension is no longer held in place, and the cube shining because creation has returned to stable geometry. And that is the wedding. Not metaphorical romance, but the completion of covenant order, prism and axis in permanent union, circulation purified, Eden's brilliance flowing without delay. This has been the Sin of Malice Exposed podcast. If you've listened this far, keep exploring the rest of our content, where I go deeper into these dynamics of grace, distortion, and covenant theology as geometry, and how Ezekiel's wheels compare to our PTS-RUS system.